I'm hoping to finish up today with the sound stimulus and the ear. We are just starting to talk about how we code for pitch or frequency at the basal membrane. So it was kind of a funny place to lop this in half because we're right in the middle of Jörg von Becke's theory. And remember, what he was doing was he was looking at dead cochlea of animals. He was sending a stimulus through that would cause this kind of wave that he could see in the fluid that would cause a wave in the basilar membrane. And he assumed a tonotopic organization where we see this kind of like a wave, like an ocean wave or a rope snap, right? Where there's going to be a peak where there is the most amount of stimulation. We're going to see this envelope where over time we're going to, because it's not an ocean wave, it's more like a rope that it can go up and down. We're going to see this envelope around it, and the peak is where we're really going to see the most change. And what this picture is showing is time 1, time 2, time 3. So over time, this wave is happening and changing. The dashed line in the picture is really showing the envelope, which is the maximum displacement caused at each moment in time. And again, because the basal membrane is waving up and down, it's not just staying on one side like an ocean wave would on the sand. This is gonna, where we see this, the largest amount of displacement is where we're going to see more bending back and forth of the inner hair cells, cilia. That movement depends on how much the basal membrane is being displaced, because remember, it's causing this kind of similar back and forth shearing of the tectorial membrane. So the hair cells at point P are going to be sending the strongest signal, which again gives us this kind of tonotopic map that there's a certain place on the basilar membrane. In this case, when we see 1 in that peak, that's going to give us a particular frequency information, a particular pitch. So this is showing the top part, so the envelopes of the vibration for stimuli between 25 hertz and 1600 hertz, so 1600 hertz. Just remember that our range of hearing is from 20 to 20,000 hertz. 25 hertz is very close to the 27.5 hertz. That is the lowest note on the piano, that low A. The piano goes up to about 4,186, I think, hertz. Our human speech is between 2,000 and 4,000 hertz, and we hear much higher frequencies than that. But if we're looking at what's happening at the basal membrane, those low frequency waves, those low notes on the piano, we see the basal membrane is having its wave is longer, and it reaches farther up to the apex. And you can see as we move down and down into higher and higher frequencies, by the time we get to 1600 hertz, that apex part of the basal membrane is not moving really at all. And we're seeing that change as a shorter, it's not reaching as far to get to 1600 hertz. And again, remember, we can hear up to 20,000 hertz. So when we get up to those frequencies, there's really not much displacement along the basal membrane at all, just right there at the base. Some evidence for place theory. So they have found the tonotopic map of a guinea pig cochlea. And you can see down at the base, we're at about 7,000 hertz. They apparently don't hear as high frequencies as we do. And as we move up and up and up towards the apex, we get, as we're into that very apex part, where we're in the very center of the winding and narrowing of the cochlea itself, we're down at 75 hertz, 60 hertz. Okay, for another piece of evidence for place theory is they've looked at frequency tuning curves. If I remember correctly, this is from a cat. And you can see, so I'm going to pick near 5,000 hertz. So we're looking at the frequency at the bottom in kilohertz. So 5,000 that's showing us 5,000 hertz, that there is a particular neuron that has a very low threshold, really close to 5,000 hertz, probably around 4,800, 4,900 hertz. Okay, that's where at a very low decibel level, it's going to start responding. And you can see there's some overlap. So it's going to respond, but it's going to take a lot more intensity for it to respond to 5,000 or down at 2,500 hertz. And we have various neurons that they measured from. This figure it makes it look like we have these really broad frequency tuning curves down at those lower hertz, like at 500, 200, which she's showing down there at 0.2, 0.5. But actually, if you'll notice the graph, that it is compressed as we go then to 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. Now that's getting really compressed. And he has a much better picture that they have not given me yet in my PowerPoints on page 274, figure 11.25. I usually put this up on the overhead that is showing those lower frequencies actually have tighter tuning curves, and we have wider tuning curves. So as a neuron, I'm responding to more frequencies up at those higher frequencies. So for place theory, we really need to update Beccasi's model. Those peak vibrations are more sharply localized than anything that he suggested or proposed. And if we ask why, it is because of that cochlear amplifier. So if you're going to go back and look at that weird picture with the circle on it, that the outer hair cells were having this kind of motile response, what Beccasi was looking at was dead cochlea, and so those outer hair cells are also dead. Your author, again, they don't give me all the pictures, but I hope you are using your textbook along with these slides and trying to understand this really quite complicated material. But on page 275, figure 1127, this is another one that I usually put up on the overhead projector because I don't have it in any other form except in the book. But it shows this really sharp frequency tuning curve at right around at maybe 8,000 hertz. And they've gone in and they have killed those outer hair cells in a cat, but everything else is working fine. And you can see that there's no longer that kind of sharp frequency tuning at that particular frequency. It still responds, but it needs a threshold of more like 60 decibels, and it's responding in a broader kind of sense to many more different frequencies than it was at where it did have this really sharp frequency tuning curve where it was down at, like 10, maybe 20 decibels tops. It was, 20 is well above, so like maybe 5 decibels. It doesn't need much sound when we don't kill off those outer hair cells. And that's another one of our ways that our ears can become damaged, is that our outer hair cells are damaged or die off. So as I said, there are two theories that discuss how we code for pitch or for frequency, and place theory is just one of them. And they're both telling us that this is how this is done. The other is temporal coding, or what's called phase locking. Temporal coding, temporal means through time, so coding through time. It's sometimes called frequency coding because remember that that what's happening with the sound wave is that those numbers of cycles per second, that necessarily tells you that's happening through time. And we're having these moments of condensation in the stimulus, and then rarefaction, and then condensation in the stimulus, and then rarefaction. And what we see is this frequency coding, or this coding that is neural firing, that is phase locked with that frequency, such that if we look across a set of neurons, we're going to see each firing at the peaks of the waves of the sound stimulus. So when I have condensation, I fire, rarefaction, hyperpolarize. Condensation, peak of condensation, depolarize, fire, rarefaction, hyperpolarize, stop firing. Okay, and for these neurons, it doesn't happen at every peak. I'm going to go wandering through my book here very quickly. He has this also, which again, I can't get in my pictures for my slides, but it's very helpful to look at the pictures on page 272 of my edition, which is the 10th edition. So figure 11.9 is showing that firing at the peak of condensation, hyperpolarizing at the peak or the point of rarefaction, most rarefaction, peak of condensation, fire, and then rarefaction, it's going the other way, so hyperpolarizing. And then in figure 11.20, he shows that this can be what they call the volley principle. So they're volleying like a ball. They're volleying back and forth between some of those neurons are going to be at certain peaks, and other neurons are going to fire at other peaks, but they're always firing at the peaks of condensation. And if we add them together, we can get them at, if we have enough nerve fibers, we're going to see them firing at each peak of condensation. Okay, and this is going to provide information in that way about the frequency of the sound wave in this kind of phase locking or temporal coding. And this occurs up to a frequency of about 4,000 hertz. So just to put that all together, frequency coding, or coding for pitch, at the level of the cochlea and the auditory nerve, like how we're doing this in our auditory system, is based on both which fibers are firing, which is the place theory, that tonotopic map that we see on the basilar membrane. We see that across the entire range of hearing. It also depends on the timing of the nerve impulses, where we see this temporal coding or phase locking to those peaks of condensation. And that's happening up to about 4,000 hertz. If you remember me saying back, I'm going to say it again, back on one of the previous slides, that if you get that top note on the piano, I think, if I'm going to get my numbers right, it's right around 4,186 hertz. I might have the exact numbers wrong, but notice that that's right close to 4,000 hertz. And if you go up to those top notes on the piano, if you possibly can, again, if you really don't know what I'm talking about, I suggest going to one of those Pecknell or one of those stores where you can go tinkle on pianos, tinkle those top few notes. You'll notice that it gets hard to tell which direction the pitch is changing. You can tell that there's a change, but it's hard to tell the direction. And so this temporal coding or phase locking appears to be very important for what is musical, what becomes potentially musical in our ability to perceive. And again, all of this is originating in the inner hair in the inner hair cells. Which ones are firing, the timing of firing, and their auditory nerve fibers, so the auditory nerve fibers that they are communicating to, that are then going to take the information to the brain. Okay, so I have just a few more slides left today, and these first two are, one of them, the next one he took out of the book, and this one I went and searched for and stole it from a biological psychology book by someone else, and I can't remember which one I used, so, and it's in my office, so I'm not going to go find that. But my first question after all of this was, well, how do we code for amplitude or loudness of a sound at the basilar membrane? Because if normally what happens with neurons is the stronger the stimulus, right, the faster the firing rate. But now the rate of firing is going to depend on the frequency, and we have these higher frequencies, meaning faster firing rates, and it's telling me about pitch instead of about amplitude. Well, it looks like instead we use a number. So remember we have 3,500 inner hair cells per ear, and we're using a number of those neurons that are going to be responding at different levels to different pitches, or for particular pitches, they're going to have different thresholds before they fire. And so if we have more and more neurons firing, in this case, it's going to tell us something about amplitude. And if we look at just 500 hertz, which this author, whoever it was, has marked here, there's at about 40 decibels, it's going to be neuron B is its threshold, and it's going to start firing. But for neurons A and C to fire, it needs to be up more towards like 60 decibels. And if we look at 5,000 hertz, you can see I'm just out of the tuning curve of the characteristic frequency for E. But so I need what looks like about maybe 40 decibels for E to fire, maybe 60 decibels for F. And if we get out to G, maybe more like 80 decibels. And so we're going to see a number of neurons firing as we get to a particular frequency and as we get to louder and louder threshold, or louder and louder, higher and higher amplitudes. Another real mystery is how we code for timbre, because remember those harmonics that we are hearing. So in this example, they're showing 200 hertz over on the left-hand side. And remember, this would probably be 220 as that particular A. But then we have the 200 hertz, 400 hertz, 600, 800, 1,000, as we're keeping the difference of 200 to tell us about the pitch itself. But if we look down through those, the top one is showing the guitar, the particular amplitudes for the guitar. The middle one is showing the amplitudes of those harmonics for the bassoon. And the bottom one is showing the amplitudes of those different frequencies, those different harmonics for the alto sax. Well, what's happening on the basilar membrane, right? And so I've put in a different picture here that doesn't completely connect with those pictures, but notice at the basilar membrane, right, I'm going to see at 440 hertz, there's going to be this peak, this wave, this peak at 880 hertz and at 1320 hertz. If I'm at 440 hertz A, but if I hear the same sounds from the guitar, the bassoon, and the alto sax, those are all just slightly different amplitudes that are giving me the different harmonics. And especially if I hear them at the same time, most of us can usually pick out the guitar from the saxophone, even if they're playing the same note at the same time. But really, that's just overlapping at certain frequencies, certain amplitudes, or certain amount of basilar displacement. So how we figure that out and distinguish those timbres, we're going to go into auditory scene analysis in the next couple of lectures, and it's pretty fascinating to me that we can do this at all. Kind of a little bit mind-blowing a lot of the times, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you that it has a lot to do with top-down processing and our past experience. So we're going to come back to also bottom-up versus top-down processing kinds of discussions here. Okay, I might be ending just slightly early to talk about hearing loss, and I know this is going to be a teeny bit disjointed because I want to play my game on Monday, where if I'm playing my game when I'm talking to a machine and nobody's here to play with me, I feel like that's not going to be fun at all. But we get to do auditory scene analysis on Monday, and then we're going to jump back to, I think this will work, the brain structures. So I'm going to talk about hearing loss. I usually get some questions, so that's a good way to start on Monday. And I usually start by distinguishing conductive hearing loss from sensory neural hearing loss, where conductive hearing loss is something going wrong with those ossicles in the middle ear, whether something gets infected or one of them gets broken or whatever happens to cause something to happen in the the middle ear. And that is something that a hearing aid can help with, because it's basically amplifying all sounds, which is what the middle ear, what those ossicles are doing. Sensory neural hearing loss comes in a number of different shapes and forms of whether we are born with something that is wrong in the inner ear. So at the sensory level, sensory receptors, something wrong with the auditory nerves. Usually it's something in the inner ear for people who have that kind of hearing loss. And so they might get a cochlear amplifier where that is receiving signals, processing and translating those signals, and then transmitting them directly to the auditory nerve fiber itself. Not to say that that's the perfect answer. And if you know people from the deaf community, some of them really resent the cochlear amplifier and feel like it takes their children and the people who would have this sign language in that community, that it takes that away from them. But if we have that damage maybe later, we really might want a cochlear amplifier, and it's still not the cleanest, best answer in the world. So I've had one student who was going into speech pathology, speech and language pathology, who had run a study where they put a cochlear amplifier on her so she could hear how it sounded, and they were testing certain sounds and having her respond. And she said there were some sounds that just sounded like this broadband noise in the middle of someone speaking, and it was jarring and distracting and difficult to handle. So not necessarily the best answer in the entire world, but gives them some sense of hearing. This sensory neural hearing loss can happen during our lifetime. In one way, through presbycusis, which I talked about, presbyopia, which was old sight. Presbycusis is old hearing. It really does happen much more dramatically in industrialized societies where we have some noise-induced hearing loss that's happening throughout our lives. And for most of us, this is happening throughout our lives. Our hair cells get more, are getting older and stiffer, and so they are easier to damage. But apparently in pre-industrial societies, they really don't have much presbycusis. They really don't have much hearing loss. And some of this noise-induced hearing loss that I've been talking about, that we're more and more likely to get as we get older, that we're more sensitive to it. We can get this at any point in our lives, whether it's work-related. I think your author goes into, I don't remember if this is still in the book, you know, some of the OSHA rules of not allowing people to work these 8-hour shifts in this really loud noise, that they require breaks, they require earplugs. Now, I've had students tell me before, like their father worked for Michelin and they never wore their earplugs, and they didn't give them breaks, and so not necessarily, again, being completely taken care of, but presumably it's better, and that we do at least have the choice to wear these uncomfortable earplugs all day. And what appears to be happening more and more, now that we've gotten the rules from OSHA, from our occupational group, is the leisure-related noise-induced hearing loss. And again, I can't remember if it's still in the book. I've gone through several editions of this book where he shows that we're getting up above the threshold of pain for pretty much the whole soccer game almost, when we are looking at the decibel level in a soccer game. And when we think about the concerts that we go to, and just the amount of screaming, if you've ever watched any videos of those old Beatles concerts where you didn't even hear the music because people were just screaming. And so there's leisure-related hearing loss as well, which apparently we are choosing to have this leisure-related hearing loss. And it's not just concerts, but a lot of our mechanical devices now, they have them set up where we can keep them at a level. And I think they even have it where you can see when you go above the level of where you might be causing some damage to your inner hair cells or outer hair cells. And I mean, I wouldn't listen to my music more softly because of that, and most people don't. But hopefully you're smarter than me, and you will think about not causing that kind of leisure-related hearing loss. And the other thing we can do, so even if you're like me and you're like, no, I'm not gonna, I like to feel the music, you know, I really like my music to be loud. You can learn that you can take breaks from that overstimulation, and I think it is, you might want to look in your book to make sure, but I think it is every hour or so you take a good 10-15 minute break, because it's really being in that that amplitude level for some amount of time where we're going to see more and more likelihood of killing off those inner and outer hair cells. Okay, I went on much more than I wanted to. Hearing loss is interesting. Hope you guys have questions, and hope I answered some. We'll talk on Monday.